This is the glaze room. Now we'll talk about getting your bisqueware glazed so it's ready to go into the gas kiln. All the glazes need to be stirred before you use them. What happens is, even after 10 minutes or so, there will be a thin film of water across the top. So when you dip your pieces in, the glaze won't apply evenly. If the glaze hasn't been stirred for overnight, we usually stir with the drill. And in between glaze sessions or glaze session classes, we will use a whisk to stir the glazes up. If you're comfortable using a drill, you're welcome to. Otherwise, we usually stir the glazes with a drill in the beginning of the day. This glaze hasn't been stirred in a couple weeks, so you can see there's a couple of inches of water on top of the glaze. While you're glazing, the layer of water will be very thin and sometimes you won't even see it. So it won't usually look this separated. The other thing I should say is that the thickness of the glaze varies between the colors of the glaze. And the way that Chris and I check the thickness of the glaze is literally by dipping our finger into it, so I'll show you that in a second. This is a thin slip. You can see the edge of my fingernail. This is a thicker glaze, typical for dipping your pots into, and this is a very thick slip, designed for brushing on leather-hard clay. Once the glazes have been stirred, they only need to be whisked before you use them. That's usually all you need to do, and it's perfectly okay to leave the whisk right in the bucket because the lid covers it up. When you go to glaze your bisqueware, oftentimes the best thing to do is rinse it before you glaze. Pots that have laid around in the studio for a long time may be dusty. And the best way to control the thickness of the glaze is to control the moisture content of the bisqueware. If you have a very thick pot, you are best to get it damp before you dip it in the glaze, because the pot acts like a sponge, and if your pot is very thick, it will absorb quite a bit of water, leaving a thick layer of glaze behind. This is a very thin pot, and I know how thick the glaze is, so I don't actually need to rinse this off. It wouldn't hurt to rinse it and then wait 10 minutes or so, though. The glaze will almost always go on more evenly when the pot is damp first. When you go to rinse your pieces off, all you need to do is get them damp. Don't get them soaking wet or the glaze won't adhere to the piece. That's pretty much it. You can see that the bisque pot absorbs the water very quickly. Now it's ready to glaze. It's okay to glaze the pot as soon as the water is absorbed into the bisqueware, or you can just leave it on the counter and glaze it in the next 20 minutes or so. If you wait longer than that, the pot will start to dry again, and you should rinse it all over. It's always a good idea to minimize skin contact with the glaze, even though I know there's no toxic materials in the glazes that we're using. So one good way is to simply put on a pair of vinyl gloves. And one recommendation would be to, when you come in to glaze, put on a pair of gloves, do your glazing, and then simply throw the gloves away. That protects your hands. If you wash your hands when you're done, you're safe. The danger with these glaze materials would be that you would ingest them. So as long as your hands are clean when you finish, you're good to go. I generally don't wear gloves unless I'm going to stick my hand right in the glaze. I have more dexterity, obviously, with my bare hands. So what I do is I use glaze tongs frequently when I glaze my pots. That prevents my hands from getting in the glaze. It's a very simple way to glaze. And we have two different styles of glaze tongs, and different pots I use different tongs for. I'll glaze this bowl without glaze tongs, and you could glaze all these parts separate colors if you wanted to. I'd use one color. I usually glaze inside the foot ring first and then glaze the interior. And the reason for that is if anything spills or drips, you can clean it off before you do the outside. This way of glazing leaves very little that needs to be cleaned off before you put it on the kiln, on the shelf. The pot is dry enough for me to touch it without leaving fingerprints, but it's easiest to clean if you clean it while the glaze is still damp. And the easiest kind of sponge to use is the biggest one. If I just press the foot into the sponge, I can more or less clean off the area that needs to be cleaned quite readily. I'm just cleaning off the glaze until it gets to where I left a break in the form. That looks good. And on the inside, if I just press the sponge into the foot, I can clean down the inside of the foot just a little bit, so the glaze is not going to be touching the kiln shelf when we put it in the kiln. That's clean enough. You need to inspect everything before you put it on the glaze fire shelf. If there's glaze on the bottom, we'll check and we won't put it in the kiln, but this glaze would stick the pot right to the kiln shelf, which would ruin it. So make sure there's no glaze on the bottom of your pieces. It only takes a moment to clean it up so it's ready to go. I'm going to glaze this bowl with glaze tongs, and I'm actually going to put some water on the table before I glaze it. When I take it out of the glaze, I'll set this right in that little puddle, and it will keep the foot wet, making the glaze even easier to clean off once I've finished. When you use glaze tongs, don't squeeze too hard because this is thin and it could crack. I'm going to dip it into the glaze sideways so as not to trap air inside the form. And all I need to do is go in and out, empty the foot ring. I'm going to hold it upside down for a moment and set it down right in the little puddle of water. If you let go with the glaze tongs while the pot is still wet, the marks will usually just heal themselves. I'll go rinse this off. If you're going to glaze lots of things the same color, obviously, cleanup is even easier. I can tell from looking at this that I can touch this with dry hands and the glaze won't come off. So I can pick it up and press the sponge into the foot ring and clean off the foot as much as it needs to be cleaned for the firing. That's all it takes. Ready to go. I'm going to double dip this mug. In other words, put one glaze right over the other. And the most important thing when you use more than one glaze, I would only recommend you use two, is to use the second layer of glaze before the first layer is dried. Otherwise, the second layer of glaze, as it dries, will peel the first layer of glaze right off. So there's the first layer of glaze. I'm just going to wait until it stops dripping and then dip it right into the next layer.